Something changed in the Middle East that no news bulletin captured with the clarity the moment deserved. It did not happen with a missile strike or a naval engagement or a public declaration that generated a diplomatic protest. It happened on a runway at an Iranian military facility in the dark, as the cargo ramps of Russian An-124 heavy transport aircraft lowered onto the tarmac, and the equipment inside was offloaded by ground crews who were not announcing what they were doing or why. By the time satellite imagery confirmed what the aircraft had delivered, S-400 Triumph air defense systems and Su-35 Flanker E fighter aircraft, the strategic calculation that Israel and the United States had been operating on since the first day of the conflict had already been invalidated. Russia had stopped observing. It had started acting, and every assumption about what the conflict's outcome would look like had just been placed under pressure it had not been designed to withstand. The weeks of Russian diplomatic positioning that had preceded the delivery, the carefully calibrated statements expressing concern, the calls for de-escalation, the public neutrality that Moscow had maintained while Israeli and Iranian forces exchanged missile strikes across the region, now revealed their actual function. They had not been expressions of genuine ambivalence about the conflict's outcome. They had been the cover under which a material intervention was being prepared, timed, and staged for delivery at the moment of maximum strategic effect. The silence before the cargo flights was not neutrality, it was preparation. And the preparation had been conducted with the discipline of a government that understood exactly what it was doing, and had decided that the moment to do it had arrived. Russia's strategic interest in Iranian survival as a functioning, militarily capable state was not a recent development generated by the current conflict. It was the product of years of parallel positioning. Two governments that had both experienced the specific pressure of comprehensive Western sanctions, both developed the institutional reflexes that sustained economic and military capability under that pressure, and both calculated that their strategic interests aligned along a sufficient number of consequential dimensions to justify a relationship that went beyond tactical convenience. For Moscow, an Iran that collapsed under sustained American-Israeli military pressure was not a neutral outcome. It was a direct loss, the removal from the regional strategic board of the partner whose continued viability gave Russia its most significant leverage point in the Middle East, at a moment when maintaining that leverage had become more important than at any previous point in the relationship's history. The S-400 Triumph system that emerged from those cargo bays was not a weapon that improved Iranian air defense capability at the margins. It was a system that changed the category of threat that any aircraft operating over or near Iranian territory had to account for. The engagement envelope, extending to 400 kilometers with simultaneous tracking capability across multiple threat categories, from low-altitude cruise missiles to high-altitude ballistic trajectories to the reduced radar cross-section signature that stealth aircraft generate, covered airspace that Israeli aircraft had been transiting with a degree of operational confidence that the previous Iranian air defense architecture could not credibly threaten. That operational confidence was not simply a tactical advantage. It was the foundational assumption on which the entire air campaign had been constructed. Strike packages had been planned around it. Target sequencing had been built around it. The ability to conduct operations over Iranian territory with acceptable risk to aircraft and crews depended on it. The S-400's arrival did not simply add a threat, it invalidated the risk calculus that the campaign had been executing against. The Su-35 component of the delivery operated on a different dimension of the same problem. Where the S-400 restructured the defensive environment that Israeli and American air operations faced, the Su-35 introduced an offensive air-to-air capability into the Iranian order of battle that had not previously existed in any form that required serious planning attention. The Iranian Air Force's existing inventory, F-14 Tomcats, maintained through improvised supply chains across 4 decades of sanctions, F-4 Phantoms that had been in service since before the Islamic Revolution, domestically produced variants that reflected the limitations of what Iranian aerospace engineering could achieve without access to foreign technology, had not constituted a credible threat to the aircraft that Israeli and American forces were operating. The Su-35 changed that calculation in ways that could not be dismissed as marginal. A highly maneuverable fourth-generation plus fighter with thrust vectoring, advanced radar, and the long-range air-to-air missile capability to engage targets before they can respond, represented a genuine threat that required genuine planning adjustments, not because it created parity with Israeli or American aviation, but because it created a threat environment in which operations that had previously been conducted with high confidence now required accounting for adversary capability that had not existed the previous week. The electronic warfare dimension of Russia's delivery package received less prominent coverage than the S-400 and Su-35 transfers, but carried implications that were in some respects more immediately consequential for the operational environment. Ground-based electronic warfare systems in the Krasuka family are designed to address a specific asymmetric advantage that American and Israeli forces had maintained throughout the conflict: the ability to operate surveillance and strike assets with high confidence in their own situational awareness, while denying the adversary reliable knowledge of where those assets were, what they were doing, and what targeting solutions they were developing. That asymmetry had been foundational to how the air campaign functioned. Aircraft that know where the threats are and can plan around them operate very differently from aircraft that are uncertain about the threat picture. Missions that can be planned with accurate intelligence about adversary positioning and activity produce better outcomes than missions planned against a degraded or uncertain intelligence picture. The Krasuka systems were designed to introduce exactly that uncertainty into the operational environment of forces that had been planning around its absence. The specific threat that ground-based electronic warfare systems pose to airborne surveillance assets, including the high-altitude, long-endurance unmanned systems that had been providing continuous intelligence collection over Iranian territory since the conflict began, was not primarily about destroying those assets, though suppression of their sensor capability was a direct effect. It was about degrading the quality and continuity of the intelligence picture that the entire targeting and strike planning process depended on. A surveillance asset that is being jammed may still be physically present in the airspace, may still be transmitting, may still appear to be functioning normally from the perspective of the operators monitoring it. What it is no longer doing is collecting the signals and imagery with the fidelity and coverage that the targeting process requires. Decisions made against a degraded intelligence picture are made with lower confidence and higher risk of error. And in a conflict where the distinction between military infrastructure and energy infrastructure had been carrying enormous strategic weight, the difference between a high confidence and a low confidence intelligence picture was the difference between targeting decisions that could be defended and targeting decisions that produced the kind of consequences no administration wanted to manage publicly. Washington's response to the Russian material intervention produced a set of statements and a set of actions that diverged from each other in ways that analysts tracking both simultaneously could not reconcile within the official framing. The statements emphasized continued American commitment to Israeli security, the strength of the alliance architecture underpinning the American regional presence, and the range of options available to the administration for responding to Russian escalatory behavior. The actions told a different story. Carrier strike groups that had been operating at distances reflecting confidence in the operational environment began repositioning to distances that reflected a recalculation of the threat picture. Mission planning cycles for strike operations lengthened as planners incorporated the S-400 engagement envelope into route planning for aircraft that had previously been able to treat large portions of the regional airspace as permissive. Intelligence collection priorities shifted as the Krasuka deployment created uncertainty about the reliability of collection that had previously been treated as dependable. None of these adjustments were announced. None of them appeared in official statements. All of them were visible to anyone tracking operational patterns with the tools and access required to observe them. The dilemma that Russia's intervention created for American decision-making was not a tactical problem with a tactical solution. It was a structural problem embedded in the conflict's fundamental architecture. The American commitment to Israeli military operations depended on an operational environment in which Israeli air power could function with acceptable risk against Iranian targets. The Russian deliveries were systematically degrading that environment in ways that each individually might be manageable, but that collectively were shifting the risk calculation of continued operations in a direction that the political commitment to those operations was not calibrated to absorb. escalating American involvement to directly counter the Russian systems, striking S-400 batteries on Iranian soil, jamming Russian electronic warfare systems, creating the conditions for direct engagement between American and Russian military assets, meant steps toward a confrontation that neither government had publicly indicated any desire to approach, and that the domestic political environments of both countries were not prepared to support. Accepting the degraded operational environment without responding in ways that altered it meant publicly demonstrating, through the behavioral evidence of operational adjustments, that Russian material intervention had successfully constrained what American-backed forces were willing and able to do. 1258. The regional diplomatic consequences of Russia's intervention developed on a timeline that moved faster than the official American response could effectively manage. Gulf state governments that had maintained varying degrees of alignment with American strategic preferences across decades of regional security architecture were recalibrating their external relationships with a speed and visibility that suggested the Russian deliveries had accelerated a process of strategic reassessment that had already been underway, rather than initiating one from a standing start. The governments making these adjustments were not ideologically sympathetic to Moscow or Tehran. They were pragmatically calculating which external relationships provided reliable protection in an environment where the capability balance had just shifted and where the American commitment to enforcing the previous balance was visibly constrained by the escalation dynamics the conflict had generated. Saudi Arabia's positioning was the most consequential single signal in the regional diplomatic picture, given its scale, its oil production capacity, and the historical depth of its security relationship with Washington. Riyadh had watched the conflict develop with the attention of a government that had direct exposure to Iranian-aligned threats through years of Houthi drone and missile strikes against Saudi infrastructure, strikes that the American security relationship had not prevented and had addressed with varying degrees of effectiveness. The Russian deliveries added a new dimension to the calculation Riyadh was running, a conflict that ended with Iranian military capacity fundamentally degraded would reduce the Houthi threat that Saudi Arabia faced directly. But a conflict that escalated to the point where Russian-supplied air defense systems were engaging American or Israeli aircraft over Iranian territory created an environment of regional instability whose consequences for Saudi energy infrastructure, financial markets, and domestic political stability were not obviously manageable through the existing American security relationship. The question Saudi leadership was asking was not which side to join. It was which posture minimized Saudi exposure to consequences that the existing American commitment had demonstrated it could not reliably prevent. The UAE's response expressed itself primarily through economic channels that were quieter than diplomatic statements but more durable in their structural implications. Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth funds had been diversifying their exposure away from dollar-denominated assets across years of gradual portfolio adjustment that had accelerated as the conflict generated uncertainty about the stability of the Middle Eastern economic environment. That diversification was not a sudden response to Russian cargo flights landing in Iran. It was a long-running strategic adjustment, whose pace was being influenced by the conflict's demonstration that the physical infrastructure of the regional economic environment, energy facilities, shipping routes, financial clearing networks, was more vulnerable to deliberate disruption than the assumptions built into pre-conflict portfolio construction had accounted for. The Russian deliveries reinforced the conclusion that the disruption was not temporary and that the adjustment needed to be structural rather than tactical. Qatar's simultaneous exposure to multiple contradictory pressures illustrated the complexity of the regional diplomatic environment with particular clarity. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the Middle East, the facility through which a significant portion of American air operations in the region are coordinated. Qatar had been conducting back-channel communications on Washington's behalf since the conflict's opening days. Qatar also has direct ownership stakes in gas infrastructure that Israeli strikes had damaged. And Qatar had been receiving the same message from Iran that every Gulf state was receiving. The message that American protection had demonstrably failed to protect infrastructure that American allies had ownership interests in, and that the choice between continuing to host forces that made Qatar a target and finding an accommodation that removed the targeting rationale was a choice that each Gulf government was going to have to make on its own timeline regardless of what Washington preferred. The Russian deliveries gave that message additional weight by demonstrating that the capability environment in which American protection operated had just become more complicated in ways that the American security guarantee had not been recalibrated to address. India's positioning in the evolving diplomatic picture reflected the calculation of a major power that had developed the institutional habit of maintaining relationships with multiple competing external partners simultaneously, a habit built across decades of non-aligned foreign policy that had been updated for the current multipolar environment without abandoning its fundamental logic. New Delhi had maintained its energy relationship with Russia throughout the sanctions pressure that the Ukraine conflict had generated, absorbing discounted Russian crude through financial arrangements that bypassed dollar-denominated clearing systems with sufficient creativity to avoid triggering the secondary sanctions exposure that Washington had been applying to other buyers. The same institutional flexibility that had made that energy relationship work was available for application to the Iranian context, and the Russian deliveries to Iran signaled to governments watching from New Delhi that Moscow was prepared to extend the protective dimension of its relationships to partners under direct military pressure in ways that had operational rather than merely rhetorical content. That signal carried weight in the calculations of governments that were assessing whether the Russian relationship offered something the American relationship did not. The BRICS framework that had been expanding its membership across the years preceding the conflict was acquiring, through Russia's material intervention in Iran, a dimension that purely economic or diplomatic multilateral institutions cannot generate independently: the dimension of military credibility. An institution that can sign trade agreements and issue communiques expressing shared positions on international governance questions serves a real function for its members. An institution whose leading military power has demonstrated willingness to deliver advanced weapon systems to a member under direct military pressure from the world's most capable armed forces serves a categorically different function. The demonstration was not lost on the governments that had been assessing BRICS membership or deepening engagement as a hedge against the constraints of operating within the American-led institutional framework. Russia had shown, through the cargo flights and the systems they delivered, that the Moscow-Beijing axis at the center of the expanded BRICS framework was prepared to translate stated solidarity into material support when the moment required it. That demonstration changed the value proposition of BRICS alignment in ways that years of summit communiques and trade agreement signings had not. China's role in the emerging picture operated on a timeline longer than Russia's military intervention and through channels less visible than cargo aircraft landing at Iranian military facilities. But its strategic implications were at least as consequential for the conflict's long-term trajectory. Beijing was not delivering weapons to Iran. It was doing something that operated on a more durable level, systematically constructing the economic architecture through which Iranian energy production could reach Chinese consumption through routes and financial mechanisms that bypass the dollar-denominated clearing systems and maritime choke points that American sanctions leverage and naval presence depended on controlling. Long-term energy agreements denominated in yuan. Infrastructure investments connecting Iranian production to Chinese demand through overland corridors that did not pass through the Strait of Hormuz or any other waterway where American naval capability could apply physical pressure. Financial arrangements that settled transactions through mechanisms that American secondary sanctions could not reach without triggering confrontations with Chinese institutions that Washington was not prepared to pursue at the scale required to make the pressure effective. Each of these arrangements individually represented a marginal reduction in the effectiveness of the sanctions architecture that American strategy had been using as a primary coercive tool against Iran for decades. Collectively, they represented a structural erosion of that architecture whose cumulative effect was to reduce the economic isolation that sanctions had been designed to maintain to a level where it no longer produced the behavioral changes it had been intended to generate. Iran operating under comprehensive Western sanctions with Chinese energy relationships, Russian military support, and BRICS institutional connections was not the Iran that sanctions architects had modeled when they designed the pressure campaign. The model had assumed a degree of international isolation that the current geopolitical environment, with its competing great power interests, its alternative financial infrastructure, and its expanding coalition of governments that had decided that the costs of American alignment exceeded its benefits, was no longer producing. The energy economics dimension of Russia's intervention carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate military balance into the structural foundations of the global economic order that American strategic primacy depended on maintaining. Iran sits on hydrocarbon reserves whose scale places it among the most significant energy producers on Earth. Russian protection of Iranian territorial and political integrity was simultaneously Russian protection of an energy resource base whose continued availability to markets operating outside the American-led financial system represented a direct challenge to one of the most consequential instruments of American geopolitical influence. The dollar's status as the default currency for global energy transactions had been a foundational component of American leverage since the post-war order was constructed. That status depended on a set of conditions: American naval capability to project force into the waterways through which energy moved, the political alignment of major energy producers with the American-led security framework, and the absence of viable alternative financial infrastructure for settling energy transactions outside dollar-denominated systems that were all under simultaneous pressure from the dynamics the conflict had accelerated. When oil prices approached $150 per barrel as a direct consequence of the Hormuz disruption and the accumulated damage to Gulf energy infrastructure, the economic consequences were not evenly distributed across the global economy in ways that aligned with the geopolitical divisions the conflict had created. American consumers faced retail gasoline prices that generated domestic political pressure. European economies dependent on imported energy faced inflationary consequences that their central banks were not positioned to address through conventional monetary policy tools. Asian manufacturing economies dependent on affordable energy inputs faced cost structures that compressed margins and reduced the competitiveness that their export-dependent growth models required. The countries that were positioned to benefit from sustained high energy prices, Russia, which exported oil and gas at prices the conflict was elevating, and the Gulf producers who had not aligned fully with the American-led response, were on the opposite side of the geopolitical divide from the countries absorbing the costs. That asymmetry was not accidental. Russian strategic planners had understood it as a feature of the conflict's economic architecture from the beginning, and the military deliveries to Iran were in part a mechanism for sustaining the conditions that maintained it. The psychological dimension of Russia's intervention, the effect it produced on the calculations of governments, military planners, and financial actors who were observing it from positions of uncertainty about what came next, operated through channels that were more difficult to measure than missile engagement envelopes or cargo manifests, but no less consequential for the conflict's ultimate trajectory. Deterrence is not a physical phenomenon, it is a cognitive one. A condition that exists in the minds of decision-makers who are calculating whether the costs of a contemplated action exceed its anticipated benefits, and whose calculation incorporates their assessment of what the adversary is capable of, willing to do, and likely to do in response. Russia's material intervention in Iran changed those calculations across multiple decision-making environments simultaneously, in ways that did not require a single Russian weapon to be fired against a single American or Israeli asset to produce their effect. Israeli military planners who had been developing strike packages against Iranian nuclear infrastructure were now developing those same packages against a target set that included S-400 air defense systems, whose engagement envelopes covered the approach routes those packages would need to use. The addition of that planning requirement was not simply a logistical complication. It was a fundamental restructuring of the risk profile of the operation, changing it from a strike against defended but penetrable targets into a strike that required first suppressing air defense systems whose destruction would constitute direct engagement with Russian-supplied equipment operated by personnel whose training and, in some cases, physical presence Russia had provided. The legal, diplomatic, and escalatory implications of that engagement were not ones that Israeli military planners could resolve within their own planning authority. They required political decisions at levels above the military planning process, and those political decisions were operating in a domestic and international environment that was not generating clear authorization for the escalatory steps the changed operational environment required. American military planners were running parallel calculations whose complexity had increased in direct proportion to the capabilities Russia had delivered. The carrier strike groups operating in the region were now planning their operations against an air defense environment that included systems capable of engaging their aircraft at ranges that fundamentally changed the geometry of what operations were feasible from what positions. The electronic warfare environment had degraded the intelligence picture that targeting decisions depended on. The diplomatic environment had become more constrained as Gulf state partners signaled their unwillingness to provide basing and overflight access for operations whose escalatory potential had increased with the Russian intervention. Each of these constraints individually was manageable. Their combination was producing an operational environment that was progressively less conducive to the kind of decisive military action that the conflict's stated objectives required. The global financial system was processing the implications of the conflict's trajectory through market mechanisms that operated faster than any diplomatic response could match. Gulf sovereign wealth funds, whose combined assets represented a significant fraction of the capital invested in American and European financial markets, were reassessing their exposure to assets whose value depended on the stability of a regional security architecture that the conflict was visibly straining. The reassessment was not producing sudden large-scale capital withdrawal that would have been immediately visible in market price movements. It was producing the gradual, careful, deliberately inconspicuous portfolio adjustment that sovereign wealth funds make when they have concluded that a structural change in the risk environment requires a structural change in their exposure, adjustments that accumulate over months into shifts whose ultimate scale is larger than any single movement that would have attracted attention at the time it occurred. When those adjustments eventually became visible in aggregate, the narrative about why they had occurred would be written in retrospect. The process generating them was already underway. What came next depended on decisions being made in conditions of uncertainty, time pressure, and incomplete information by people whose options had all become more expensive than they had been before the cargo flights began. That is the environment that strategic interventions of this kind are designed to create. Not the dramatic military engagement that generates headlines, but the quiet, cumulative restructuring of the decision environment that forces adversaries to choose between options that are all worse than the options they had before. Russia had executed that restructuring with a precision and a timing that would be studied in strategic analysis for years, regardless of how the conflict's specific military dimensions ultimately resolved. The Middle East that existed after those cargo flights landed was not the Middle East that existed before them. And the governments calculating their positions in the new environment understood, even if they were not saying it publicly, that the change was structural rather than temporary, that the strategic landscape had shifted in ways that did not reverse when the immediate conflict eventually concluded. Leave one question in the comments. Do you think Russia's decision to deliver S-400 systems and Su-35 fighters to Iran represents a permanent turning point in Middle Eastern security architecture, or a calculated risk that carries consequences for Moscow that aren't yet visible? Every response gets read, evidence first, analysis second. You decide what it means. Subscribe and turn on notifications. When the S-400 systems become fully operational and the first direct engagement between Russian-supplied air defense and American or Israeli aircraft occurs. When Gulf state diplomatic repositioning produces formal consequences that change the geometry of American basing access in the region. When the financial adjustments being made quietly by sovereign wealth funds become visible in aggregate market movements. And when the energy and economic dimensions of this realignment begin producing effects that the current conflict coverage is not connecting to their source, the analysis will be here.